I described some of the views that have been influential historically with regard to animals, specifically the views that we don't have any direct duties to animals. I then said that if we look at today's society on the whole, most people probably do think that we have some duties to animals, to be kind to them, not to be cruel to them, but that our interests essentially trump their interests where there is a conflict. And I raised the question as to, well, which interests of ours trump their interests, and pointed out that there is some tension, at least, in the idea that we can't cause them to suffer for our own amusement or entertainment, but we can cause them to suffer if that helps us to produce food more cheaply. One way of defending that distinction we make is that something like the indirect duty view, that enjoying activities in which animals suffer, like bullfighting or dogfighting, is likely to be bad for our character. And therefore, the reason for prohibiting that is not so much because of the animal suffering, although that is what people focus on, but because we think it's bad for people to enjoy a spectacle in which animals suffer. There was a line that the English historian Macaulay used about the prohibition of bear baiting. Bear baiting was a cruel sport in which bears were tied up and teased in various ways, and it was actually banned long before other forms of cruelty were banned. It was banned by the Puritans during the 17th century in England. And the historian Macaulay said the Puritans banned bear baiting not so much because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators. The idea being that Puritans just didn't like you getting pleasure. But maybe that's a little unfair. Maybe it's that they thought it was encouraging people to have a bad character if they did get pleasure from watching a bear being tormented. Anyway, this is the alternative view that I've argued for, the view that, in fact, we should not only consider the interests of animals, but we should give equal weight to similar interests of animals. So it's a principle of equal consideration of interests, which I think is also perhaps the best way of understanding the idea of equality among humans. And it's saying this principle, which is often invoked as a principle of equality among humans, that we should give equal consideration to the interests of all humans, irrespective of race or species. I'm arguing irrespective of race or sex is the usual way of putting it among humans. And I'm arguing that we should extend that to species as well. Now, it's important to understand exactly what that involves and what it doesn't involve, because some of the criticism is really based on a misunderstanding of this position. So, for example, here is another species of beings that actually live not very far from here. This photo was taken on Cherry Grove Farm down in Lawrenceville. This is an organic farm and it produces beef, and here are some of the calves that are being reared for beef with their mothers. As you can see, with plenty of food around. So you could say their interests are being met, at least at this point. Another question arises when they get taken to be killed. But at this point, all of their interests are being met. They have plenty of food. They're in a natural social group that is suited to them. They are protected from the elements if it should get particularly hot or cold or something. They don't. There are no predators around there. So their interests are being met. Obviously, your interests would not be met if you were confined to these fields in Lawrenceville. For one thing, you can't eat the grass, but even if food was brought to you, you have a lot of other interests that cattle do not have, including an interest in getting an education, but that's only one. You could say, well, you have an interest in travel. These cattle have no interest in travel. You have an interest in perhaps visiting New York and going to music or the theatre or something of that sort there. These cows don't. So it's not saying, of course, that we have the same interests. It's not saying that there ought to be similar treatment between humans and animals. The principle of equal consideration of interests recognises that individuals have different interests and individuals of different species have different interests that often will be related to their capacities that they have as a member of their species. Now, let me just mention here briefly another view which is not based so much on equal consideration of interests, but is based on the idea that animals have rights, perhaps best represented by the philosopher Tom Regan in his book, The Case for Animal Rights. So this is doing something similar to what I'm doing as a utilitarian in terms of focusing on interests and extending that across the boundary of species. This is doing something similar to those who think that what is really important for humans is that humans have some certain rights, basic rights, and saying the grounds on which we attribute rights to humans, at least the grounds on which we attribute rights to all humans, are also applicable to non-humans, or at least, he says, to those who are subjects of a life. And by that, he means at least mammals anyway, and those that are not infants. Because Regan is requiring some kind of consciousness, not just perhaps even the capacity to feel pain, but something more that can make a being a subject of a life, to have a perspective on that life. And he thinks that mammals beyond infancy have that and therefore are entitled to the same basic rights that we attribute to all human beings. So that's a non-utilitarian way of approaching animals and saying that, again, species is not really relevant. So what these two views have in common here is that they reject what I call speciesism. So that word obviously makes the parallel with the more familiar racism and sexism. And it's not intended to say that in every respect this is a perfect parallel, a perfect analogy. It's not intended to say that everything that we could say against racism or sexism can also be said against speciesism, but it rather is intended to say there are significant parallels here. In all of these cases, what we have had historically is one group that is dominant and that develops an ideology to justify its ignoring or at least heavily discounting the interests or the rights, whichever way you want to put it, of another group over which it has power and which it uses and exploits for its own interests. So that's very obvious, say, in the case of racism. Take the most blatant forms of racism which justify slavery. So the European racists who accepted and practiced slavery, or the slave trade, or their descendants in the southern parts of the United States, developed an ideology that said that people of the white race, of European descent, are superior to Africans, and that entitles them to deny both equal consideration of interests and, of course, rights to those Africans, and entitles them to use them, to capture them, to enslave them, to use them for their own purposes. Sexism was never exactly the same as that, or at least not exactly the same in terms of enslavement generally, but of course, similarly, males have asserted rights of power, rights to tell women what to do, rights to use women for their own purposes, and justified that with various kinds of ideologies as well. So in that respect, I think the way in which we think of animals, or have thought of animals, is parallel. We have certainly had power over them, we've been dominant over them, we've developed an ideology that justifies that. You saw some examples of that. Effectively, we do enslave the domestic animals. We use them for our purposes, what we think of as in our interests, and we don't give any regard, or we give a heavily discounted level of regard to their interests when that suits us. So that's the way in which I think there is a parallel. So you can certainly differentiate between humans, or between most humans and non-human animals in various grounds. And it's not speciesist to do so, and it's not speciesist to say it's hard to know sometimes what the interests of non-human animals are and how we weigh them against those of normal humans. So this is a problem. To some extent, it's a problem among humans ourselves. We don't really know exactly what somebody else feels, and especially, for instance, if we're dealing with, let's say, we talked earlier in the course about infants with intellectual disabilities. So if we're dealing with someone with really profound intellectual disabilities, it may be hard to know what their lives are like for them, whether they're enjoying their lives or suffering, what their enjoyments are like, how they compare with others. Those are problems that we recognise when we try to make interpersonal comparisons between humans, and they certainly can be the difficulties can be much greater when we're talking about non-human animals, perhaps less when they're like us and we can recognise similarities of behaviour. So we can feel something, for instance, if we read Jane Goodall's description of a chimpanzee, female chimpanzee, whose infant has died. If you read some of what Jane Goodall wrote about chimpanzees, you can easily empathise with the grief that the mother seems to be feeling for the loss of her child. We don't know that it's the same as a human mother would feel. It's probably not, but we can have some understanding of it. On the other hand, when we get down to animals like fish, it's much, much harder to try to work out what sort of experiences they are having. Perhaps we can get some sense of more extreme pain, as when we see a fish flapping around on shore that is essentially suffocating. But even there, it's hard to know exactly what conscious experiences the fish is having. And in other cases, say you look at aquaculture, fish being farmed, are they being stressed by confinement or not? It's really hard to know. So those doubts are definitely there, and they may be one difference between the way in which we can compare and consider the interests of animals as compared with the way we can consider interests of humans in normal cases. So that's not speciesist to say there are these difficulties, we don't really know how to weigh them, but still perhaps in some cases where we're talking about rather minor interests of humans and what seem to be very serious interests of animals, it's reasonable to say that the interests of the animals may be greater than those of the humans. And then there's the question of killing, which raises a different question about what interest do non-human animals have. But if you think back to our discussion of sanctity of life issues with humans, then of course that becomes a difficult issue with humans as well, so it's not surprising that it's difficult here. We discussed, for instance, the claim that one of the things that is most seriously wrong with killing human beings is that we cut off their preferences and desires for the future. That's at least part of what normally makes the death of a human being so tragic. And I suggested that that is a reason we can use to distinguish the killing of a newborn infant from the killing of a more mature human, and also, of course, to distinguish the killing of a fetus from the killing of a more mature human. So some of those questions come back here. We talked a little bit in talking about this life and death decisions about infants, about the idea that you might replace an infant who starts life with very poor prospects because of a serious disability. You might in some sense feel that it was better to replace that child with another child if a couple felt that they only had the capacity to have 2 children, that's all they wanted, and let's say their second child was born with a severe disability, they might feel it's better to let that child die and have another child with better life prospects. Well, that question can be raised in terms of killing animals as well in the circumstances where you're producing those animals in order to sell them, in order to perhaps sell them to be killed for their meat, and you have you can then replace them with other animals. Is that something that is ethically defensible? There's no obvious answer to that comes out of the rejection of speciesism. You have to consider what it is that makes killing wrong, both in humans and non-human animals. So here's a conservative British philosopher, Roger Scruton, who has written about how we ought to treat animals, and writing from a conservative point of view, and he's disagreeing to some extent, he believes, with the views that I've held about how we ought to treat animals. But at least this part of what he says is not something that is speciesist. He's pointing to a difference between cattle and humans, and he's saying something along broadly similar lines to what I've said, that one of the things that makes killing a human being normally so tragic is that you cut off that life before that person can achieve what they were hoping to achieve, or what they wanted to achieve, or what they were likely to achieve. This is one of the reasons, I think, why we think that the death of a 20-year-old is normally much more tragic than the death of an 80-year-old. Because we think an 80-year-old has probably achieved most of what he or she is likely to achieve during their lifetime. Maybe not. Maybe there are things that it would still achieve, and if so, then that's part of the loss. But in general, it's more tragic to be cut short before your time, as Scruton is saying. But does that apply to cattle? It's reasonable to raise that question and to say perhaps it doesn't, and so then Scruton's claim here can be seen as drawing a real distinction. So that's a position that is not answered by speciesism, and you have to think about whether the animal has enough interest in continuing to live to say that killing an animal painlessly is in itself wrong, independently of the suffering you cause.